This lesson is about pacemakers. When the heart's electrical conduction system begins to fail, a pacemaker may be required to maintain heart function. In this lesson, we will discuss basic pacemaker functions and problems. Pacemakers can be configured to meet the patient's specific cardiac needs. Lead configurations may include single chamber, dual chamber, and biventricular configurations. Single chamber configurations have a lead positioned in the right ventricle. This lead can pace the ventricles as well as sense electrical activity from within the ventricles. Dual chamber configurations have a lead positioned in the right ventricle as well as a lead positioned in the right atria. These leads can sense and pace in the atria or the ventricles. Biventricular configurations have a lead positioned in the right ventricle, in the right atria, and also a lead positioned just over the left ventricle. This lead isn't in the ventricle, but it is positioned, it's fished through the coronary sinus and positioned just outside of the left ventricle. Now let's discuss the different types of pacing based on different cardiac needs. Atrial pacing is when the pacemaker is only pacing the atria. I'm going to draw a dual chamber configuration. So there's a lead placed in the right ventricle and also the right atria. Now with atrial pacing, the lead positioned in the right atria is the only lead that's pacing. So when it initiates atrial depolarization, it paces the atria, which creates a pacing spike on the isoelectric line. And as it depolarizes the atria, it causes this P wave, and then it travels, that electrical impulse travels down through the AV node, down through the bundle branches simultaneously, and produces a narrow QRS complex. Unless, of course, the patient already has a bundle branch block. In the example below, you can see there's a pacing spike before each P wave and a relatively narrow QRS. Ventricular pacing. Ventricular pacing may be a single chamber configuration where there is a lead positioned only in the right ventricle, and it initiates pacing just in the ventricle. So on the isoelectric line, you'll see a pacing spike just before a wide QRS. And the QRS is wide because, unlike atrial pacing, that electrical impulse can't travel from the atria down through the bundle of His and down through the bundle branches simultaneously, but it originates from within the ventricles, so it takes longer to depolarize the ventricles. And this is ventricular pacing. Now here's another example of ventricular pacing. It just looks a little different. Now, this example strip below, you can see there's a P wave in front of each pacer spike, and then a wide QRS complex. In this scenario, you have a dual chamber configuration, so we have one lead positioned in the right ventricle, one lead positioned in the right atria, and what's happening is that this pacemaker lead that's positioned in the atria is sensing for atrial activity. So the SA node is still pacing the heart. And what the pacemaker is doing is it's sensing the SA node as it depolarizes the atria. And it senses that, and it sends that information back to the pacemaker. And then the pacemaker says, okay, the SA node initiated depolarization, pace the ventricles. And so the ventricles pace, and what happens is you have a P wave that's generated by the SA node, and then you have a ventricular pacing spike that follows that produces a wide QRS complex. So why would we do this? If the SA node is pacing appropriately, why would you want to just pace the ventricles? Well, maybe this patient has heart block. Maybe they have heart block and those impulses are not traveling down to the ventricles like they're supposed to. And then you might say, well, why don't we just pace the ventricles? Why are we using the SA node? Well, the SA node is the best indication of how fast or slow to pace your heart. If you're sleeping, your heart rate needs to be less. If you're running, your heart rate needs to be more to increase with your cardiac demands. So the SA node is the best way to pace the heart, and the pacemaker, if the SA node is functioning properly, it will use it. And this is asynchronous ventricular pacing. It's using the atria and the SA node to pace the ventricles. AV pacing. Well, in AV pacing, that is another dual chamber configuration. We have a lead positioned in the right ventricle. We have a lead positioned in the right atria. And both are pacing the heart. So maybe in this scenario, we have heart block and we have SA node dysfunction. So maybe the SA node doesn't pace or doesn't pace fast enough to pace the heart properly. And so the lead in the atria needs to pace the atria, and then the lead in the ventricle is also needing to pace the ventricles. So this is manifested by a pacing spike in front of the P wave and also in front of the QRS. So you have a pacing spike, the atria depolarizes, then you have another pacing spike, and the ventricles depolarize. This ensures AV synchrony. And like we've learned before, the best way for the heart to pump is when the atria contracts first and then the ventricles contract. Because when the atria contracts first, it loads the ventricles with blood, and then the ventricles contract and it sends that blood out to your body. So this promotes AV synchrony. Biventricular pacing. So biventricular pacing has a lead position in the right ventricle. It has a lead position in the right atria. And then also it has a lead positioned outside of the left ventricle. So in this configuration, you see the example down here, there are two pacing spikes in front of the ventricles. So we have the left ventricle is initiating depolarization, as well as the right ventricle lead is initiating depolarization. And this is meant to cause the left and the right ventricle to contract simultaneously. And this is also called cardiac resynchronization therapy, because to make the heart a more efficient pump, you want both the right and left ventricle to contract at the same time. So this is a way to make that happen. And you may also see a P wave in front, so it would be asynchronous, or you may see a pacing spike in front of the P waves, which would be called a biventricular pacing. So you may have the atria pacing and also the ventricles pacing right and left both. So you would see three pacer spikes in that scenario, where you have a pacer spike in front of the P wave and then two in front of the QRS. And that's biventricular pacing. Pacemaker problems. Failure to capture. Failure to capture is when the pacemaker initiates an electrical impulse and there's no cardiac activity. Why would this happen? So in this scenario, we'll just draw a single chamber pacemaker that is vent pacing. And you can tell that because there's a pacing spike in front of each QRS followed by a wide QRS. So it's vent pacing. And then we see a pacer spike with no cardiac activity. So nothing happened. This can be caused by insufficient voltage of the pacemaker. The pacemaker is programmed with a certain amount of voltage to elicit a cardiac response. Also, lead displacement. Well, these leads are anchored into this tissue within the chamber. And if that lead were to become dislodged and just float around in that chamber, it would initiate an electrical impulse, which you'd see as a pacer spike. However, if it's not touching the cardiac tissue, it's not going to produce an electrical impulse or a cardiac activity. So this is called failure to capture. Failure to pace. This is just like it sounds. It's supposed to pace, and it's not. And how would we know if it's supposed to pace? Well, if you know the patient has a pacemaker, you would not expect the pacemaker to allow a long pause to occur. For example, 5-second pause, no pacemaker is going to allow that. So what would cause the pacemaker to not pace? Well, pacemakers have sensitivity settings, and if the pacemaker is oversensitive or oversensing, it may sense electrical impulses that are not cardiac activity, but they think it is. Like, for example, here, these little stars, EMI stands for electromagnetic interference. And if that pacemaker senses an electrical impulse that is coming from somewhere else besides your heart, it might think that your heart's beating on its own. So here and here, it thinks there's a heartbeat. So A sense. So it's sensing an electrical impulse that it thinks is coming from your atria. So it's not pacing, because it's not supposed to pace if your heart's already beating. And that could be a potential cause for failure to pace. Undersensing. When a pacemaker is undersensing, it is not sensitive enough. So it's not going to sense your already present cardiac activity. Now in this example down here, you've got vent pacing, and then what happens? It looks like your heart starts beating on its own. Now, the pacemaker should sense this and stop pacing, because it doesn't need to pace if your heart's beating on its own. However, the pacemaker in this scenario is not sensitive enough to identify your heart beating, and so it continues to pace right through it. Now, this can be very dangerous, because if you have ventricular pacing on your T wave during that relative refractory period, this could potentially cause a lethal arrhythmia, like we talked about with RON-T PVCs. Now, if your patient has a lethal arrhythmia, they may also have an implantable cardioverter defibrillator, or ICD. ICDs can sense lethal arrhythmias and deliver an electric shock that is meant to reset the heart's electrical conduction system. So what you might see is, here's our ventricular fibrillation, and the pacemaker senses this fibrillation, and it knows it's a lethal arrhythmia, so it delivers an electric shock, which may look like this. Often it's just off the charts. And when it comes back, you hope that there is a normal rhythm. And you can see that in the example strip down here. Here's our electric shock. So before that, you have this arrhythmia. The pacemaker shocked the heart. And then following that shock, you can see it comes back to a normal rhythm. There looks like an A pacing spike. Looks like that's a P wave. And then there's a vent pacing spike followed by a wide QRS. So a pacing spike in front of the P wave and in front of the QRS means that they're back in AV pacing. And this concludes our lesson about pacemakers.